Geologists agree that by 8000 BC, the great Wisconsin and Worm ice caps had retreated. The Ice Age was over. It has been postulated that the deluge myth in North America may be based on a sudden rise in sea levels caused by the rapid draining of prehistoric Lake Agassiz at the end of the last ice age about 8,400 years ago. However, the 7,000 years prior to that date had witnessed climactic and geological turbulence on a scale that was almost unimaginable. The few scattered traces of surviving humans must have led lives of constant terror and confusion, with periods of time filled with violent floods and climatic changes. The bulk of the animal extinctions took place between 11,000 and 9,000 BC, when there were violent and unexplained fluctuations of climate, which geologist John Imbrie has called a climatic revolution. Now, there is a very interesting theory about exactly how this whole thing took place and what it means for us today. To share this theory, we've borrowed a clip from our friends at Gaia from one of our favorite series, Ancient Civilizations, featuring Graham Hancock, Greg Braden, and a ton of other experts as they help to decipher the clues of the ancient past. What's especially remarkable about this theory is that it aligns very well with the story of Atlantis and an absolutely massive shift of ages.
Let's first of all consider the world during the Ice Age. Everybody's heard of the Ice Age. What was the Ice Age? The last Ice Age set in about 125,000 years ago. And it saw the buildup of giant ice caps, primarily on top of North America and on top of Northern Europe. Exactly why the Ice Age happened is still a subject that scientists argue about. But it's not in dispute that an ice cap 2 miles deep sat on top of North America and a huge area of Northern Europe, that same 2 mile deep ice cap. It reaches its maximum extent about 21,000 years ago. The temperatures are warming almost actually to modern levels, and the ice is beginning to disappear. And then suddenly, 12,800 years ago, really suddenly, literally overnight, everything changes, and the Earth is plunged back into a massive deep freeze. This is a time of huge extinction of species are wiped out. The new evidence that is providing coherent sense to this is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And it has been put forward by a large group of mainstream credentialed scientists. And what they've said is that they have found evidence which suggests the Earth was hit by several fragments of a comet. For a long time, the comet was out there. It was probably a very spectacular visual presence, but it wasn't hitting the Earth. But 12,800 years ago, by which time that comet had begun to fragment, had broken up into lots of fragments. And the estimates are that 4 of those fragments hit the North American ice cap. It's literally beyond imagination. That instant of impact would have created so much heat that it would have melted large areas of the North American ice cap and sent the water flooding south. Then within a matter of days or weeks of that release of water, the freezing temperature has begun, and there's no more release of water. The world goes dry at that point and into a very deep, dark, frozen period accompanied by animal extinction. The Younger Dryas lasts for 1,200 years. It lasts from 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago. And then something else really weird happens. The Earth's been in a deep freeze. Suddenly, 11,600 years ago, you get a second massive pulse of meltwater into the world ocean. One very strong suggestion is that the intersected again with the debris stream of the same comet, and that there were further impacts 11,600 years ago. But those impacts were not us. Those impacts were entirely oceanic. You get big comet impacts in an ocean, and what you're going to get, as well as extraordinary tidal waves, what you're going to get is a massive amount of water vapor thrown up into the upper atmosphere. And that water vapor creates a greenhouse effect, which accounts for the very radical warming of the Earth. It has to be rather intriguing that that's the exact date, 11,600 years ago, that Göbekli Tepe is founded. And it has to be even more intriguing that 11,600 years ago is the exact date that Plato gives us for the destruction and disappearance beneath the flood of the ocean of the lost civilization of Atlantis.
This hypothesis is further backed up by an independent study featuring over 20 authors, which finds evidence for meteor or comet impacts on 4 different continents: North America, South America, Europe, and Western Asia from about 12,800 years ago in the form of nanodiamonds, spherules, and melt glass consistent with meteor impact. Randall Carlson is a PhD who incorporated the dating of Göbekli Tepe with geological evidence which suggests global flooding. He wrote that if an impact actually hit and there was a cataclysm, you could easily see how an effect of that magnitude would destabilize the Earth for perhaps 1,000 years or so. It's after this window of time that the Younger Dryas geological records shows an abrupt change in climate that we date Göbekli Tepe. But you see, this is not where the expedition ends in the search for answers about the Great Flood, as Graham Hancock has also put forward even more information in his most recent book, America Before. His new work focused on various kinds of evidence from the Americas, mostly from the mound-building cultures of the Mississippi River Valley and exploring the sacred geometry of the Amazonia, bringing to light some connections that seem to indicate that the occupation of the Americas was much earlier than is currently thought, and even appears to share some common concepts in ideology to that of the ancient Egyptians. Now, before we go any further, we should point out that the occupation and colonization of the Americas is a hugely controversial topic and has been described as one of the most agitated, fierce, and fruitless debates in modern archaeology. In fact, there are sites such as the Bluefish Caves and the Old Crow Flats, which demonstrate human habitation in the Americas thousands of years before previously thought, and thus were met with fierce scrutiny. So it's no surprise that Hancock's work is often met with instant rejection. Now, Graham theorizes that a precursor civilization, which he argues were found in the Americas, were wiped out by global flooding, and the survivors of which helped to seed later mythological stories. This idea is made even more interesting by the evidence of dramatic sea level rises during or just before the Younger Dryas. In a nutshell, around 12,900 years ago, the world was warming up from the last glacial maximum and becoming increasingly habitable when a comet entered our atmosphere and broke into several major fragments, many of which impacted the North American ice sheets. The tremendous impact of this comet hitting the Earth would have caused a few key things to happen. First, we would have seen a large amount of freshwater flooding into the lower coastal lands and entering the oceans, disrupting the natural ocean currents and raising the sea levels. Second, we would have a tremendous amount of steam shooting into the atmosphere, along with smoke from any fragments that didn't land in ice and starting fires upon impact. All of this together would block out the sun for a very long time, and this causes a sudden drop in Earth's temperatures. This is exactly what we see happen by climate graphs of that time period. This rapid drop, followed by 1,000 years later, the rising of Earth's climate. To date, no scientific or geological hypothesis comes close to answering the mystery of what caused the spike closer than the comet impact hypothesis. Graham even suggested that if this were to have happened, it's possible that parts of the giant ice sheets, these massive glaciers, could have broken off from the main mass and slid across the Earth slowly. If this was to happen, it would have destroyed anything that it slid over, ultimately leaving us with no record or even ruin of any civilization that might have been there before.